everyone, welcome back. And in this video, we should start first with the idea of a stand or standing. So there's a couple different metaphors or examples that you can think of to get an idea of what the word stand represents. You of course have a hat stand, which is something that is usually has legs on it and is a pole, and then it has these little branches that come out like a tree that you put hats on, which of course is similar to a coat stand, and often the hat stand and coat stand are combined together into one. Of course, most people don't use hat stands and coat stands nowadays, except for maybe the luxurious hotels and high-rise buildings and old places and whatnot, and you might be able to find versions of them in museums or maybe in antique stores. The next is a microphone stand, which of course most understand in terms of the word a stand for a thing. Now, the less well-known idea of a stand is that of the banner stand. Practically speaking, what most churches have as the so-called cross symbol and what people wear around their necks is actually a banner stand. It's the same thing as somebody wearing a small version of a microphone, hat, or coat stand around their neck. The banner stand was designed for somebody to hang a banner from, well, anywhere for any reason, because there were many different reasons for it. And so those are the objects where we get the concept of a stand, basically. You have a lot of different ways that this is used to represent concepts. You've got a stand-up guy, you have understanding, you have somebody who is withstanding. That's a a particular term that has to do with who has the right, or who has the ability to argue something is somebody who has standing, right? You've got the idea of having a standing in society, having a certain standing. And that's where, of course, we get the idea of setting the standard. The idea of setting a standard is like somebody who emplaces the banner, right? They put the banner up, it's what you follow, right? It's where you go, it's how you know that you've arrived at a place. There's many different uses for a banner. And so when you set the standard, that's the idea there. It's like planting a flag. Then you've got, of course, taking a stand, and like I said before, having standing. So a standard in this context is a visual display that represents, say, more than one thing, such as a sign outside of a clothing shop does not represent, say, just shoes. It represents coats and shirts and ties and dresses and underwear and a whole bunch of other stuff, right? So when you put up a sign for a clothing shop, you'll probably put up, say, maybe more than one article of clothing, whereas a hat shop, of course, would have the picture of a hat. So that's sort of the idea here, is that a standard is a visual display rather than what we think of, which is a written list of rules, right? Standards to live by, the idea of holding yourself to a higher standard, right, versus a lower standard, which of course has to do with the imagery there, has to do with position, physical position, where it's in place. One higher is better, of course, when it comes to standards. So the standards are set not simply by the physical object. The physical object is where the idea of a standard comes from. So there's a lot of different examples we can look at today of how standards are set through visual display, even though that's usually not the connection made. Of course, the biggest one comes out of churches, The visual display standard set by churches has to do, first of all, with the land, right? Land domination. They have these really tall, high steeples, right, with this big, massive dominion of the horizon. They also expand out over the land. And they, of course, they're not the only ones that do this, but the churches specifically are known for this kind of setting a standard through visual display. Essentially, the idea of putting a banner up, the bigger banner, bigger than anyone else, right? And of course, you've got Rome, which does that. Also, they use the attire, right? They've got different dresses, they've got the frocks, they have the sash, they have all this nice clothing, this stuff they put over themselves. You have the priest robes, you have all this different attire, which the entire purpose for that is a visual display to follow for setting a literal standard. Ritualized practices, while they aren't any physical object, usually they do involve physical objects, also set a visual standard to follow. So there's other types of standards we can look at which are a little bit less physical. The church practice is generally based around physical perception. And it doesn't matter which church. If it's Muslim, their physical perception is all based around attire. Practices the mosque, that's particular building design. And if you look at Buddhists, it's all about the beads, which are equally used by Catholics, which is interesting, and the robes, the shaved head. It's all of these religious practices, they're all based around following a physical representation over content, right? That's mainly the idea there. They understand that if you want to set a standard, you have to do it based off of what is seen. Which, of course, is the same idea behind military dress uniforms, for one. But naturally also people dressing up, putting on better clothing to go to different events, has to do also with that showing of a standard idea. So the main contrast between the United States, so-called northern territories, and northern countries like Canada and northern Europe is contrasted to the southern region, which is to say that there's a general regional standard among people's habits, something they recognize. So, from my experience personally, going through Ecuador and Mexico, I discovered that the main practical standard set by most is that poverty is the visual appearance of poverty is over the visual appearance of ostentation or wealth, which of course is contrasted to the cathedrals and churches, which are just lined with gold and jewels, and they're just a obnoxious visual display of old style representation of wealth, very old buildings and whatnot. Whereas the people, right, you could go to, say, Puebla, where they have this enormous, or well, really any of the cities with their giant basilicas and whatnot, and right outside is somebody who is peddling cheap items, say candles or whatnot, dressed extremely poorly. And of course you see that same idea with monks and nuns and other types of and missionaries, right? They choose to dress themselves in an impoverished manner. And you find that perspective everywhere in people's private homes, everywhere. They laud poverty, and they believe there's some kind of nobility in poverty versus wealth. Well, it's the complete opposite in a place like the United States, where people don't want to admit if they are quote-unquote poor or impoverished. They would do everything to maintain the appearance of wealth. Culturally, across the board, people act like that. You find it in everyday conversation. Just that's been my experience. right? You could have somebody in the United States who's poorer than somebody in Mexico, and the person from Mexico would look like a vagabond by choice, and the person from the United States would obviously look like some sort of super wealthy aristocratic noble or something like that. So it's a complete contrast there. Now there's other types of examples that we can look for visual standards that are set, being the idea of setting down a banner but also carrying one, that which is followed. And the first elements for this visual standard idea is of noise and light, which we can find in police cars or any other type of sheriff or highway patrol or ambulances, right? They all have these loud noises and bright lights, and you get out of their way when you see them, or you follow them through some sort of situation. And that is a standard set off of visual display. Another example are parades. In some places, schools specifically parade out the different marching bands and the girls with the spinning the stuff and all the nonsense and all these, all this visual stuff to basically dominate the horizon and say, we set the bigger standard. That's the idea there. Obviously, funerals and school buses are other examples of that. A funeral procession is setting the standard. It's sort of a standard of death, if you will. And the school bus is a standard of control over children specifically. And I've done videos talking about that as well. Now, when you understand these types of visual expressions used to control people's behavior and to get people to follow a particular order of doing things, based solely off of visual display, mind you, but obviously done with a understanding of what that visual display is supposed to represent, well, we can look in a different way than usual at the first three original Star Wars movies. A New Hope, Empire Strikes Back, and the third one, which is Return of the Jedi. Now, the Empire is the operative word there. While I was growing up, I was continuously told that the Empire was a representation, a fictional representation, a metaphor, if you will, for Nazi Germany, specifically, as they always say and repeat constantly. However, it's very obvious in the term empire and various visual representations that it actually represents not Nazi Germany, but the old and continuing empires established by mainly the Vatican, called the Imperials. Specifically, the colors of the Teutonic Order. Speaking of books, buy books from me, written by myself. I've done my own editing, I've done my own writing, I've done my own cover and artwork, so you understand that there's no individuals coming in and revising and tweaking little parts to sanitize it. At SC Coleman, author, all one word, .bigcartel.com. The white, which was worn with a black cross over it, is representative in the white and black of the stormtroopers. Also, they wear naturally those helmets that look a lot like the Crusader helmets of the Teutonic Order. Now, the Empire was the word used, and the Imperials is the word still used for the large armies of mercenaries that were sent into the Prussian region specifically of the 16, 17, and 1800s. Mainly the 14th to 16th centuries, however. Those are the main periods in which you saw ravaging by the specifically by the Empire, which is a word used not only for the Pope elected empire, but you have the Holy Roman Empire, you have the Russian Empire, and mind you, the Russian Empire and the Holy Roman Empire both had black eagles set up as their banner. And basically the idea here is which we'll get into this a little bit, it's the idea of the imperial system as it relates to a kind of shifting control of power, the ability to pull strings of different regions, locations, and people. So the other element to notice is that, and it wasn't by accident at all, and you don't see it anywhere else in any subsequent movies because it was completely removed except for that one fact that it's associated only with that character, the broom handle Mauser of Han Solo. The broom handle Mauser is a specific firearm in profile to the Prussians of the 1800s, late 1800s until World War II. The broom handle Mauser is a specific design that has not been replicated by anyone else, and it was designed in that period, and it is the choice weapon for the character Han Solo, a smuggler, has that sort of bad boy kind of caricature to him. And that was specifically chosen to show that the Prussians were not Nazi Germany, and they were not the empire, but rather they were in conflict against the empire, because the empire is the same one that's still going on today, and it's the same group and the same control structure that says that Star Wars is written about fighting Nazi Germany. It's not, because they don't call it Nazi Germany, they call it the empire, which is the word for all the imperial forces that the Vatican sends out to devastate, ravage, and destroy. Which comes from that primary phrase, dividi et impera, divide and conquer. That is where you get your word empire. It is literally conquer. So the imperial system is, if you look up the imperial system, spelled I-M-P-E-R-I-A-L, because you have imperial and imperial, which are essentially the same word with just one deviation in the letter. Impera is with an I, but you could of course change that to an E and you would still sort of get the same sound, impera. So that's the same thing going on with imperial and imperial. So you've got, of course, empirical and empirical. If you look up empirical, it has a slightly different definition to empirical, which they, according to them, empirical is dealing with strictly facts alone versus theories and abstract topics or ideas and whatnot, which of course is a narrowly focused definition of a word that has many other meanings to it, but that's part of the distortion of language that we have going on, more so now than maybe before, but either way, it has been going on a long time. The conquistadors, therefore, are the same. It's the same way. If you call somebody a conqueror or a conquistador, you are calling them an imperial, according to the word impera, meaning to conquer. So the next thing that this empire does, this imperial structure based primarily around religious organizations, the visual display, the setting the standard through light and sound and dominating the horizon, those types of things. Well, when you're an opponent to them, they specifically attack the opposing standard, right? It'd be the same thing as walking up to somebody who's got a banner and then just throwing a whole bunch of crap on it or setting it on fire or something like that. That's basically what they do. Obviously, in many cases, it's not as simple as just walking up to some wall or something on a wall and throwing tomato sauce at it like idiots in museums. Instead, you have to attack you have to basically make it so that the standard you're attacking is removed from something as something you follow and rather something to avoid. So that way that somebody who puts that standard up gets people to avoid them rather than follow them. So the first example today that we can look at has to do specifically with veterans, military veterans. The empire seeks to replace the current militaries with their new global peacekeeping order. Well, in order to do that, they need to destroy the standard, the visual standards set by military veterans. Military veteran, especially in the U.S. Marine Corps, puts on the dress blues and automatically, just from donning that uniform, sets a standard that everybody else wants to emulate. People around them, they lift themselves up, they walk higher, they elevate their head, whatnot. And so the first thing they want you to do is to feel bad about your uniform specifically, so you don't put it on and you intentionally degrade yourself and remove the standard that uniform represents. The next thing they do, and the primary thing they do, is the idea that if you join the Marine Corps or the military in general, then you will end up on the street. Repeated often in the phrase that why should we be doing things for illegals when our veterans are all on the street? You find this often repeated in specifically churches today. That phrase is repeated as a planned operation of subversion to remove the standard that veterans set, and basically saying if you join the military, you will end up on the street as a vagabond, as a beggar, homeless. It's not an example to emulate. Now, the next thing they do is they try to turn military, specifically veterans, right, people who got out of the military, but military in general, into benefit beggars. When you join the military, they get you to join by promising all these different benefits. And then when you get out, and while you're in as well, these benefits they promised you, you find out you have to go through a whole bunch of strings, and you basically have to prostrate yourself in order to get the thing that they offered you. It is, of course, a fake offer, and the entire idea is to present you as a beggar for benefits. So either you're homeless and on the street, or you have to go around begging, and that is the standard they want to set for military. It is done on purpose. It's because they want to eliminate people's inherent trust in military members, and they want to shift it over to so-called law enforcement, mainly, which are really uniformed thugs who are designed for the global restructuring of peacekeeping forces. It's all about imagery, about the lens, and setting the standard. That's why you see so much propaganda today coming across YouTube and every other outfit talking about the sanctity of the Back the Blue, Blue Lives Matter, and the courageous work of so-called law enforcement. They're not really law enforcement. They're thugs, for corporate thugs, basically. They're security guards. Well, they're a little bit more than that, but they're mercenaries as well, of the empire. They're doing the exact same thing that the mercenary forces of the empire did in the 1600s Europe, when they went around just butchering, slaughtering, and causing general mayhem and destruction. Naturally, you don't want that to be the image, because then people will not follow that. You want a different type of standard. And so all of the videos of cops getting shot, right, of a police officer pulling someone over to give them a ticket, and then as soon as they walk up to the window, bam, right in the face, they die. All videos like that are being censored. The only thing you're allowed to see is the standard set. The so-called law enforcement are to be followed and lauded. Anybody who joins the military is to be demonized and turned into a homeless beggar, prostrating themselves for promised benefits. So the next thing, of course, is that if none of these tactics work to make the enemy or opponent standard degraded so that it's instead of something to follow, it's something to avoid. Well, if that doesn't work, if something's resilient to that, the next thing you do is you target them for ostentation, for disgusting displays of luxury, basically saying things like, well, why are you showing all this wealth when there's all these poor people across the planet? The usual one. Don't waste food because there's people starving in Africa, right? I'm sure everybody's heard something like that, or people starving in India. Of course, there's that fun joke in Big Bang Theory where the Raj character from India says, not only are there Indians starving in India, or children starving in India, but there's an Indian starving right here. Obviously playing words there. But the idea there is, if you can't get them for that, then you attack their ostentation, their visual displays of luxury, to tear down that standard being set, that thing to emulate, because that person's wealthy and they're showing it. Well, how did they get there? People want to know, because they want to do that too. And so they go to that person, they start asking them. Well, the way to flip that on its head is to say that person's a hoarder and a thief and a liar. And the reason why they're doing all this wealthy stuff is because they're not giving it to the poor, and they're not doing all that other stuff. And so rather than going up and asking that person how they became wealthy, instead you get people in the community to demonize them, attack them, and treat them like crap. Only in reality because that person is setting up a contrary visual standard to that of the imperial controller types of people. And so that's a different concept when you understand that this is a battle over standards. The image of a standard. So today, because of this, not only is this the case with the visual display, but we're also taught only to follow the visual display and only things that are of a visual appearance, right? You've got the gay pride stuff, all that visual fanfare and display and whatnot. You've got all the different sports. All of that's about visual display, wearing sports colors and doing a bunch of noise and making a bunch of, different dances and things like that. So standards are not always based on appearance. It is supposed to be that the appearance represents other things to emulate. Just like I made that example of a sign outside of a store representing either a clothing store or a hat store, right? The standard is not supposed to be in and itself the objective. But that is the current situation today. The objective is only to be the standard, only the visual appearance with no actual substance behind it. That's the whole point in getting individuals to focus solely on sex, on things that have to do with genitalia or activity or emotion, trying to tie it all to some kind of physical aspect so that people only ever focus on the standard and not what the standard's supposed to represent. Because once you do that, you find out that a lot of these standards that we follow, like the cross, which is actually just a frame for putting a banner on, or a standard frame, represent the absolute most evil activities imaginable. You won't notice that if you are not looking behind at what the standard actually represents. So, like I mentioned before with the veterans, not only is there the idea of attacking other rival standards, but also those who do not follow your standard. So today we have particular standards set up for us. We have the church standard, which is the visual attire, the buildings, and the cross and all that stuff. Okay, if you don't want to follow that standard, that's fine. You have to follow the school sports standard then. All the people putting on their different outfits and attire of whatever ridiculous mascot team they have with the Cats and the Jaguars and the Dolphins and all this nonsense. And you have to, get involved in ritual practices and different superstitions, quote unquote, and you have to play your fantasy games, and you have to get together with the guys on the Sunday and drink the beer and whatnot. You've got that standard to follow. Okay, you don't want to follow that standard either? Well, then over here you've got the gay pride standard, which involves all of these other different things where you have to follow that visual display. Let's say you don't follow any of them. Now you're going to be punished. And the way they do that mainly is through poverty. If you don't have a favorite sports team, for instance, then you get ostracized in financial situations. You can't do anything, right? Same with the church, right? Either you go to church and you get connections and you network, quote unquote, that way, and you get things like bank accounts and loans, and you do business and you make contracts and you get jobs. Well, if you don't do it that way, then you do it with sports teams, right? You go around and hang out with people and talk to them about sports. And if you don't do it that way, then you do it with this like woke ideology crap and nonsense, which is just another version of the same religion, all based around visual display and nothing else. Well, if you don't do any of that, then you are cut off. You are enforced into poverty, made to be a recluse, somebody to avoid. In this situation, you understand how they make it so that lying is lauded, but telling the truth is degraded or denigrated. Now, the reason for that is because if the visual standard is all that matters, then lying just means you are maintaining the visual standard, whereas telling the truth is not, right? It's not all about appearance when you tell the truth. If you're lying, on the other hand, if you do it in such a way that it maintains the appearance, the standard, then that's all that matters. And that's the type of situation we're living in because of the, specifically, people following the visual displays of standards. Obviously, one of the primary ways that they denigrate telling the truth is by saying something like, don't be a know-it-all, and different taglines like that. Get good grades and get a good job. And of course, naturally, in all contexts, if you disrupt the standard, mean you damage the visual appearance of the standard, then you are punished to the utmost extent possible. So I would say an example of this is the reason why you never see a school bus with graffiti on it, right? I've never seen a school bus that has any graffiti on it, driving around or anything. They're always sparkly and clean. But, you know, the passenger rail trains, right, they're just complete chalk marked with graffiti. You go down under bridges, there's graffiti everywhere. Various buildings in certain locations have graffiti everywhere. That's not an accident. Anybody who besmirches the standard of the control structure is effectively punished as much as possible, which is, there's many different mechanisms for that. So you can look at the school system as well as the corporate system. And so let's go look at the corporate system in the sense that it is not, there's two things in the corporate world that stand out more than anything else. The first one is, say, showing up to work late or not missing quotas, things like that, missing deadlines. But above all else, people who will get instantly fired most of the time when they quote-unquote disrupt the workflow or disrupt the working environment. They use this word a lot, disrupt. The reason why that is the primary focus is that if you their standard is so flimsy because it's all about visual appearance that if you disrupt it by, say, wearing a tie at a certain angle or not doing things according to a dress code or not wearing your uniform properly, things like that, well, then you're disrupting their visual standard, which is literally their control. Their control is based around following this appearance. Now, when you understand this concept, that it's all about the visual standard and not what it represents, it is completely understandable why child trafficking specifically and child traffickers are rewarded with great wealth, mansions, and they're made into the visual representation of what you want to be, what you want to follow. With, of course, the quiet part, never spoken, being that the way that they got there was because they trafficked children, right? We're not going to say that one. We're just going to give them these huge mansions, these sports cars, all of these, if they're men, beautiful women, and if they're women, beautiful stuff, right? Mostly it's all around stuff, right? It's all about the visual representation. That is what you want to emulate. And that's the reason why you see individuals like Leon Black, major figure in so many different areas and so wealthy, obviously connected to child trafficking, just like Wexner, right? Wexner is specifically known for Ohio State University, Les Wexner, and many other things. That is a ridiculously wealthy child, a pedophile and trafficker. And then, of course, you have Jeffrey Epstein, right? A private island and this major mansion and all this other stuff. And then the next thing, of course, you have is Ghislaine Maxwell and Diddy, all representative of what it gets you to traffic children and be a pedophile. Massive, immense amounts of wealth and mansions and basically the lifestyle, the lifestyle that you're supposed to follow, the visual standard that is set. So naturally, in this context, you would want to reverse that. Most people, I would assume, would want to reverse that standard. They would want things like child trafficking and torturing children and pedophilia and harvesting children and doing all the other creepy stuff as being the standard set, while, you know, quote unquote veterans are homeless, as the saying goes all the time. So how do you reverse that standard when you understand that if you focus on the fact that veterans are homeless, well, then you're playing into their game. Veterans are not homeless. That is simply a tagline phrase to demonize them and focus away from the fact that all of these pedophile child traffickers have all these ostentatious displays of wealth, and the majority, of course, being bishops and popes. There's many other popes, like you could think of, say, the patriarch, right, from the Greek Orthodox Church, ostentatious visual displays of wealth. You could think about various different Muslim leaders. It doesn't matter who, really. If they're in the church system, if they're high up in the school system, or if they're high up in the entertainment industry, or any of these other areas where it's all about the visual display of wealth, in general, they're going to not only be child traffickers and pedophiles, but they're also going to be part of the empire that was characterized and stylized in the Star Wars franchise. It's not exactly a standard to emulate in reality. I would rather 10 times over be a quote-unquote homeless veteran than be one of them. And I think most people would agree with that. So how do we reverse that standard? The first thing that I think of that would really just be justice for this type of visual standard setting would be what the so-called Nazi Germany was accused of, which are armed youth parades. But in this context, it would be much more fitting if they wore school colors. No so-called law enforcement officer is going to mess with the parade of armed individuals regardless of their age, right? They're 16 and they're not supposed to be carrying an AR-15. Well, you put 50 of those people together marching down the street, nobody's going to mess with them except for maybe veterans, because veterans are not actually afraid of the weapon like everybody else is. Now, the next thing you can do, and of course the other thing that would be awesome about it, is if they wore the school colors in a gaudy and obvious manner, and they basically carried the school flag specifically because of the prohibitions against firearms on school campuses. That would really grind the gears of all the little corrupt pedophile child traffickers in every locality who think that they are lords of the area and that people better do what they say because they control their children. That's, you know what I'm talking about, those little Karens and the booster clubs and all the different little PSA and parent-teacher unions and all that nonsense. Now, the next thing would be essentially giving the mansions and the property of the wealthy pedophiles to specific veterans, to specific honorable veterans who will turn that property into something useful and literally change it from the idea of this place where all this wealth is contained from really disgusting practices with children, and then they turn it around into something and essentially clean the land, the area of the evil and disgusting activities of this imperial entity that happened there. So that would be a way to turn that around, and then obviously it would be a reward for veterans who did something actually useful for other people, and it would fly immediately in the face of this idea that you should emulate all of these movie stars and singer-songwriters like Taylor Swift or whatever, or any of the politicians, right? These are people to emulate, people who engage in such disgusting activities and creepy conspiracies. Another idea, of course, would be rewarding a veteran through a lottery, right? Giving some veteran a public, ostentatious display of wealth being dropped on them, specifically. And, I know personally there's a lot of people in the enlisted sector that play the lottery, and so they might actually like something like that, just as a distraction, essentially. And so the idea here that I'm trying to get into is the contrast between an incentivized visual display of behavior and activity. So you're rewarding the example, another idea of setting the standard. When you do not reward certain behavior, say being in the military, and you do reward behavior like child trafficking, obviously you get more of that. So if you want less of that, then you have to reward one over the other, and you look at what they try to demonize, and that tells you that they're attacking a rival standard. So even if it's something you might not like that much, it will still damage them to elevate whatever that standard is that they're attacking. That's the main idea here. So some other examples that we can look at here is with the idea of cell phone use. Somebody who holds a phone down towards their lap it's a visual display, evidentiary of somebody who grew up in the school system because they're hiding their phones from their teacher under their desk. So I do that myself sometimes. I have to catch myself and raise my phone because no, I'm not some person who needs to hide what I'm doing from other people, because I'm not somebody who needs to hide. They are, for one. Next, of course, is the idea of the banking standard and the trade middleman, which is essentially what the US dollar is today, and it's mainly propped up on the visual display standard set by banks. Why do banks all look the same? Why are they all the same way? Now, they're not banks, and the reason for that is because it used to be that a bank was somewhere that things would be stored. Say you deposit a certain quantity of silver or gold, and then you get a piece of paper representative of that silver and gold deposited. Well, we don't really do that anymore. If you don't have a safe deposit box at a bank, then it's not a bank. It's simply a trade medium. So, in the body, specifically the natural human form and others, you find the visual standard representative of how things are. And when they try to make everything about transgenderism or about sexual orientation or about genitalia or about what you like or don't like as far as sex goes, they are attempting to attack the literal standard set by your body alone. The brain is the most protected element of your body and of the body of any creature, pretty much. It is designed to withstand all sorts of different threats. It's contained in a solid bone structure, completely encased, and also with liquid and other things like that. They always try to talk about how flimsy and fragile your brain is. Well, it's the most protected portion of your body. Not even your heart, which if you get stabbed in your heart, there's not really any way to to get back from that, your throat, right? You know, you've got your veins and stuff. Those things aren't protected, they're left open. Your brain is the most protected element, and your genitalia is much farther down on the totem pole, so to speak, than your brain is. That is not an accident. That is the natural display visually of what to follow and what to emulate. And naturally, somebody who sets up a standard that's literally contrary to nature, they don't want you following the natural standard. They want you following their standard. So, when we understand this kind of battle over standards, or war over standards, it's not the only one going on. It's not the only war. But a good all-encompassing term that I've come up with is called the weird war. It's because it's being fought in so many different ways in so many different contexts, and it constantly changes and shifts. There's only really one main rule in the weird war, and that is to win. In this type of context, it is often difficult to see who's on what side. There's no clear line. And the idea here is representative of the two dual faces of Janus, which they say are looking for in the past and the future. Obviously, to obfuscate what the apparent representation is, which is that you should have eyes in the back of your head. You know, keep your head on a swivel is another term, and watch your six, as according to 6 o'clock on a standard analog face watch or clock. That's because you don't know who to trust, you don't know where the enemy is, you don't know where they're coming from, and they're all over the place. And things are a constant flux, and the enemy doesn't have to either be a regular person. And you can, if you aren't aware of this, then you'll step over the line and have no idea why you're being punished. You'll think it's an act of God, quote unquote, when it's not. But either way, the faces of Janus and the idea of having eyes in the back of your head is represented in the Russian and Holy Roman Empire symbols. The double-headed black eagle are the dual faces of Janus. It's very apparent there. Now, another thing that we notice is with the names. So there's a alleged woman, although if you look this person up, they're very clearly not a woman, called Helen von Friedlander, who was a character that apparently married into a family, a Prussian family, and then basically the spouse died suspiciously, and then this male appearing woman, changed his name from the original to Friedlander because the region that she had come into possession of was called Friedland. And she stirred up the people after bringing and obviously resettling the area with a bunch of foreigners. She stirred them all up to make claims over this pond, to create essentially disputes over land, and to enforce that with force of arms. I'm sure this stuff sounds familiar. However, the pattern of changing the name and of men pretending to be women, well, that's evident all over the place. In Levantine Adventure, there's a Chevalier d'Arvaux whose original last name was de Arveo. And you find this a lot. A lot of the name changes come from Italian and then before that Greek. That's because these groups are constantly moving and morphing together, but they always come from the same source. The Greek has to do with Constantinople, which is the precursor to Rome, and then Rome has to do with the changing from Italian into other languages. And you find this a lot, is that when you go through the name change, if you can, because they do like to eliminate the fact that they change their names, you'll usually lead back all the way to Greek, and then who knows from there. So that's sort of the idea of a morphine, or the study of morphology, the study of change, being able to change oneself, and also, of course, naturally being able to recognize change. The agents of this organization all represent this, and it's all about the idea of changing yourself to be able to hide among the many, just like Helen von Friedlander changed her name to Friedlander because she was in Friedland, because she would mix in among all of the other Friedlanders. We find that all over the place today. And so, when things are not what they seem, you understand better about the idea that they were attempting to denigrate from the Prussian state of so-called Nazi Germany, looking through ancestral history, looking for the anomalies that stick out because somebody came from somewhere else and changed their name. That's an obvious thing. Of course, they don't want you doing that because they're the ones that did that, and they want to keep hiding, right? They don't want you picking through that stuff. So naturally, the administration of the empire has entirely to do with copy control, as I talked about in my last video. And the biggest thing, of course, is land and property administration, with, of course, the estates or states that are connected to banking. And you find this pattern with the names in many things. Here in Ohio, for instance, we have the Ohio Job and Family Services, Ohio Means Jobs, and the Prosecutor's Office, who are pretty much always estate planning attorneys, all located in the same building. That's not a mistake, because Job and Family Services, or Ohio Means Jobs, there's two ways of looking at that. First, you could say jobs are in Ohio, basically, is one of the ways to rephrase that, right? Ohio Means Jobs is you come to Ohio to get a job. Another way is that the means to Ohio, essentially the means to administer Ohio, is through jobs. And then they ensure that those jobs will send you to Job and Family Services, right? The name, Job and Family Services. So you can beg them for stuff, and then they'll attach strings to it. And then in comes the prosecutor with these two different groups that have already set the stage for them, and the prosecutor knows exactly how to take all of your stuff, right? Including your children, your house, everything. So they all work together to do this. And of course, naturally, that idea is encapsulated perfectly in the United Nations explanation of intervention and what they do, and the fact that the primary concern is first property and then personnel. They did that, and that is the order in which they see value. Property first, then personnel. So the Keller market, as I did a video about them, is a local market, or is supposed to appear a local market, with strong ties to Switzerland. And then in most of my research, I always find that the major business controlling structure does not go to China, it goes to Switzerland pretty much all the time, with very few distinctions of going to Germany or, say, Poland or Czechoslovakia or something like that, or Romania. I've also found that one. Primarily, it's Switzerland. So, essentially speaking, you could say that, at least as far as the United States is concerned, Switzerland is the overall administrator of the United States of America, and most of the world, considering the International Code Council is a Swiss so-called non-governmental organization. Of course, Switzerland has Davos and all of these other international globalist outfits. That, what you're looking at, is the empire.